So welcome to all who have logged into this webinar entitled Unlocking the British and European Markets with UKCA and CE marking, hosted by Qualio. Before we start, if anybody has any questions, please enter them into the QA panel, which we'll be monitoring throughout the webinar. Perfect, so we can move on to our next slide just to give you a background on what Qualio is. Our CEO had a vision for life science companies, and that was to assist them to bring their products to market faster with an easy-to-use solution that focused on a quality-centric approach. With the right solution, putting quality at the forefront of an organization should make things easier and more efficient, and that's why more than 400 life science companies and healthcare businesses trust Qualio to optimize and automate their QMS. The story doesn't stop there. Qualio's platform is scalable and its software is flexible so that as your business grows, it not only meets your business requirements, but your quality requirements also. Now let's move to the introductions. We'll meet today's panel. So I'm Lola Furlong, a Senior Quality Specialist at Qualio, and I'm joined by my colleague Sumatha Kondabolu. We're so lucky to be joined by Andrew Whitten, the Managing Director at Insight Regulatory, who brings a huge wealth of knowledge to this webinar. Andrew, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your background?
Thanks, Lola. At Insight Regulatory, we help a range of medical device manufacturers with their compliance needs, such as by obtaining regulatory approvals, establishing quality management systems, developing and designing of the devices, and designing clinical studies. We also offer UK responsible person and European authorised representative services as well. Personally, I've worked within medical devices for almost 20 years now, mostly within senior regulatory affairs roles and at a range of different companies. For the last 5 years, I've worked in consultancy, where I've covered a large range of different medical devices and IVDs. I also have an engineering doctorate in medical devices with a specific focus on vascular implants.
Thanks very much for the introduction, Andrew. I'll now pass everyone to my colleague Sumatha to tell us more about her background. Sumatha, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Lola. I'm Sumatha Kondabolu, a Senior Quality Specialist at Qualio. So I have around 19 years of quality and regulatory experience in the medical device and pharmaceutical industries. I spent time with startup, mid-size and multinational companies in implementing the quality management system, the requirements for regulatory purposes like US FDA for Canada's medical device regulations, or it could be like EU MDR, EU IVDD, and IVDR, and other specific requirements for the medical device regulatory authorities that is participating in the MDSAP program. As well as I also worked for the NIOSH requirements and COFEPRIS for the Mexico. And I'm also a certified auditor for ISO 13485 and other ISO standards like 17025, 9001 for the quality management system, and IATF 16949 for the automotive quality management system requirements. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sumatha. So I'll introduce myself now. As mentioned, I'm a Senior Quality Specialist at Qualio, and prior to joining the company, I worked in quality and compliance roles in large multinationals and startups across Europe and North America. I'm also an ASQ certified medical device auditor. I have to say I've really enjoyed transitioning from industry to providing quality advice in Qualio, as I get to meet customers from a wide array of backgrounds. I learn about the interesting products they develop and ultimately help them get these products to the market quickly. So let's move to the topics that we'll be discussing today. So what we're going to focus on are what the UKCA and CE mark means for your business, guidance on the certification process, compliance tips, tactics and recommendations, and how to make sure your UKCA and CE mark auditors leave happy. Onto our disclaimer, I'd just like you to note that this webinar is based on our personal opinions and interpretations and doesn't reflect any company or organizational position. The information presented is based on our current understanding of the UK and EU regulations, and we source most of our material from various UK MDR and EU MDR documents and communications in public forums. So let's begin the webinar with a brief history on quality marks. During the 13th century, craftsmen unions called guilds were established to set strict rules for product and service quality. Inspection committees then marked the flawless goods that abided by these strict rules with a distinct symbol. Craftsmen then started adding their own mark, first to track faulty goods, but the marks soon became associated with the good reputation of a craftsman. So this combination of the inspection mark and a craftsman's own mark became a symbol of excellent product quality for customers. So the example I've shown at the top is a merchant's mark from 1530 used on woolen products. And I think it's quite interesting to compare this mark to the CE and UKCA marks found on our products today, which prove that you meet the regulations required to sell your product in the EU and Great Britain. Now we're going to have a poll question. I'll give you about 30 seconds to give your answer. So is your business aware that most CE marked products need to be UKCA marked from the 1st of July 2023 for entry into Great Britain? You can answer yes, no, or you're not sure. And I'll give that a few seconds. Maybe 5 more seconds. Great, let's take a look at the results. So that's fantastic. Most of you are aware. There are still people here who aren't or not sure. And that's brilliant because we hope that you will gain valuable information from this webinar, whether you are aware or you're not aware, in preparation for this July timeline. With that, I'm going to hand you to Andrew, who will take you through what the UKCA and CA marks mean for your business.
Great, thanks, Lola. Okay, so what is the UKCA mark? So as Lola just explained, it's a mark to show that a product conforms with the relevant UK legislation. And in the case of medical devices, it's that a device conforms with the UK medical device regulation. So a bit of background, after the UK left the EU, which was effectively on the 1st of January 2021, the majority of the UK moved outside of the EU regulatory system, including the need to CE mark medical devices. However, this only applies to Great Britain, which is England, Scotland and Wales, while Northern Ireland, which is also part of the UK, stayed within the EU regulatory system. So while Great Britain still essentially follows the EU rules, which were in place at the time when the UK left the EU, it stopped using the CE mark as a conformity assessment mark and has instead implemented the UKCA or UK Conformity Assessed mark. And this is used in Great Britain in much the same way as the CE mark is used in the EU. In order to help manufacturers with the transition, the UK are allowing the use of the CE mark on devices until the end of June next year to 2023 as an alternative to the UKCA mark. But after this time, the UKCA mark will be mandatory. So go to the next slide. So this image helps to show the timeline a little bit better as well. So that you can see here, the UKCA mark was introduced on the 1st of January 2021, and so when the UK left the EU, and can be used since then. But up until the 30th of June 2023, the CE mark is also accepted for placing devices on the market in Great Britain. But the cut-off date is the 1st of July 2023, and after that date, only devices which bear UKCA marking will be allowed to be sold in Great Britain. And of course, dual labeling with CE and UKCA is acceptable for devices placed on the market in Great Britain, and there's also no need to recall products that have been placed on the market before that date if they only have the CE mark. Now, there's only a short time for this left, especially with products that need a third-party approval. So there is a chance that this deadline will be pushed back, but it's definitely not definite, so don't rely on this. And on the subject of third-party approvals, so certain low-risk devices do not require external reviews before UKCA marking is put on the devices, and they can be what is often referred to as self-certified, where the manufacturer can sign a declaration of conformity that they themselves consider that the device meets the requirements of the regulations. And this is much the same thing for CE marking. However, for higher class devices, a UK body is required to conduct a review in order to put the UKCA marking on the device. And this usually involves a review of the device documentation and an audit of the quality management system. Again, this is very much like the CE system, but instead of a UK approved body, a notified body is needed. But we'll be covering this process more fully later in the presentation. At the moment, there are only 3 UK approved bodies, and not all of these cover all product types. For example, the last one on that list, UL, can only act as an approved body for in vitro diagnostic devices, or IVDs. And in addition, BSI and SGS, the first 2 on that list, also provide EU notified body services to their EU locations. So often it can be the case that they can provide both certifications, of, allow both UKCA and CE marking to be viewed and applied at the same time. But But yeah, with this limited approved body resource, it does look clear that there'll be problems for manufacturers to make the transition to the UKCA. And now I'll pass over to Samantha to discuss CE marking process.
Thank you, Andrew. So let's learn more about the CE marking here. So before I go ahead, so what exactly the CE marking is all about? So CE marking, it is the medical device manufacturer's claim that a product meets the general safety and performance requirements of all relevant European medical device regulations and is a legal requirement to place a device on the market in the European Union. So this is very important, and as a manufacturer, one has to make sure that the CE marking is on the device. And to understand which requirements you need to meet, you must classify the device. So that is important, the classification of the device, and identify the appropriate conformity assessment. That means that the route for your product, that is important. This dictates the required activities to demonstrate the conformity. And here, if you see, the CE marking is required for many products that it shows that the manufacturer has checked that these products meet EU safety and health and environmental requirements, and it is an indicator of products compliance with EU regulations. So that's what I wanted to mention about. And then the CE marking is required for many products. So it shows that the manufacturers has checked these products meet EU safety requirements. And then when is CE marking is mandatory? So always there would be a question on, I have seen that when we talk to our customers as well. So when is it really required? So CE marking is mandatory for products for which EU specifications exist and require the affixing of CE making. So that is CE marking. So that is important. We can go to the next slide. Thank you. So here I'll be talking more about the responsibilities of the distributor and importer for UKCA and CE marking. So the distributor and the importer must verify the CE and UKCA mark for the device. That is, the importers shall place on the market only the devices that are in conformity with MDR and UK MDR requirements. In order to place a device on the market, importers shall verify and along with the distributors as well. The storage and transportation conditions, the labeling and declaration of conformity, these are very specific, key, important requirements, especially the storage and transportation conditions. I have experienced there was one of the product that had associated with a battery that was associated with it, and specifically there were key important requirements, especially from the liability issue, where the battery shouldn't be stored along with the radioactive materials. That was the requirement from the insurance company. So if it was mentioned in the contract. And as a manufacturer, the manufacturer had to perform the validation and especially the transportation part, and then make sure that everything has been confirmed along with the storage conditions. And they had to make a protocol specifically because this product was used in the hospitals, and there could be a chance of some radioactive materials were there part of their storage where this was supposed to be stored. So make sure that these kind of requirements are specific for the product. So you have to evaluate that. And then corporate incorrective actions provide samples and access. So this is very important especially if there are any complaints that have been received, or specifically if there are any recall of the product, that's where you will be able to make sure that all the corrective preventive actions has been taken care. I have seen this during the audits when I perform. I have noticed that the manufacturer is keen on the complaints handling, whereas when it comes to the communication between the distributors and the importers, that's where it lacks. So make sure that this is streamlined across, and place only conforming products on the market. This is very important. And ensure traceability, inform supply chain, manufacturer authorities, and notified body on certain issues. If there are any issues immediately based on the risk classification, you need to identify and report to the notified body. We can go on to the next slide. So here we have a poll 2, where we will wait for a couple of seconds to go ahead. Yes. So it says, does your business manufacture, import, or distribute products that require either a CE marking or the new UK conformity assessed UKCA marking? That means, so one, yes, we manufacture products that need a CE or UKCA marking. Yes, we import products that need a CE or UKCA marking. Or yes, we distribute the products that need a CE or UKCA marking, or not sure. Or you may not be knowing, so because you might be not manufacturing it. We'll wait for a couple of seconds to see that everybody has answered these questions. Perfect. Here we have the result. So yes, we manufacture products that need a CE and UKCA marking. So this is what was expected. And I will pass on this to Andrew with the next slide on to Lola on the UKCA and CE mark certification process.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Samantha. So to commercialize medical devices in the UK and the EU, a UKCA or a CA mark is necessary. The certificate proves that your device meets the regulatory requirements under the UK MDR or the EU MDR. And just for the purpose of the next few slides, they focus primarily on medical devices in the examples, but the process is very similar for software as well as for IVD devices. So this slide that we're looking at is step one in the process, and that is determining your device classification, as this determines the conformity assessment route that you'll take. The higher the risk class, the more comprehensive the assessment. So factors such as the degree of invasiveness, the part of body affected, duration of use, whether or not the device is active, if it is a drug-device combination, all determine the classification of the device. Remember, when discussing device, you're talking about the level of risk your device poses to an end user or to a patient. Class 1 devices are the lowest risk device that do not require a conformity assessment. They're self-assessed, but bear in mind, Class 1 sterile or measuring devices do require an assessment by an independent body. Class 2A devices carry a medium risk, 2B devices carry a medium to high risk, and Class 3 devices are the highest risk class. So from Class 2A to Class 3, devices all require a conformity assessment by an independent body. Step 2 is discussed on our next slide, and this requires the identification of the applicable regulations or directives for your device. For devices being placed on the European market, the EU MDR or IVDR regulations are necessary, but for those being placed on the market in Great Britain, the UK MDR regulations will apply. For the UK MDR, devices are regulated under 3 directives, one for medical devices, one for active implantable medical devices, and one for in vitro diagnostic medical devices. And those directives are given effect in Great Britain through the UK MDR. So the EU MDR and the IVDR replace these 3 directives, and they are the set of regulations that govern the production and distribution of medical devices in Europe to ensure that these devices are produced to a high standard of safety and quality. Step 3 requires a manufacturer to identify and meet the essential requirements or the general safety and performance requirements. The best way to show that you've met these requirements is to comply with the appropriate harmonized or designated standards. In the EU, harmonized standards are the standards that have been published in the official journal of the European Union. For Great Britain, designated standards are published on the UK Public Sector Information website. So following these standards enables manufacturers to comply with the law for medical devices in Great Britain and Europe. Now remember, there's no legal obligation to comply with these standards, but it would be very difficult for a manufacturer to justify that their products have met the essential requirements otherwise. Step 4 in the process is to determine whether or not an independent body, that is a UK approved body or a notified body, needs to be involved in the conformity assessment. As we've discussed, notified bodies are organisations designated by governments of EU member states that determine whether or not your product complies with the general performance and safety requirements of the EU MDR. UK approved bodies are the same, only they're designated by the MHRA, and they assess a manufacturer's compliance to the essential requirements of the UK MDR. For the CE mark, you'll work with notified bodies registered in an EU 27 member state. For the UKCA mark, you need to work with UK appointed approved bodies. Now keep in mind, as we've mentioned, there's far fewer designated UK approved bodies than notified bodies, so this can cause delays in the UKCA marking process. Self-declaration devices don't require the involvement of an independent body, and the circumstances for self-declaration of conformity for both the UKCA mark and the CE mark are the same. I'm now going to pass you to Samantha to take you through the different conformity assessment routes.
Thank you, Lola. So now we will learn about the different conformity assessment that is required, specifically on the routes. And so conformity assessment is conducted to ensure compliance to the applicable harmonized standards. And it ranges from the manufacturer's declaration. So depending upon the device class, requirements for the CE and UKCA marking range from manufacturer's declaration up to mandatory full notified body assessment of the product, and also the manufacturing controls. It will often involve ensuring that the requirements of the applicable harmonized standards have been met. If your product doesn't need to be verified by an independent body, then it is up to you to ask to check that it complies with the technical requirements. This includes estimating and documenting the possible risks when using your product. So if you see that the class 1, that is a self-declaration, where the manufacturers of class 1 devices complying with the UK MDR, they require to have or can sign a declaration of conformity before putting UKCA mark on the device. And we can move on to the next slide, where we will learn more about the class 2A and B devices classification. So all other device classes require an assessment by an independent body, for especially for class 2A devices, to approve a declaration of conformity. That means the following are the assessments that can be conducted. That is, 1, the examination and testing of each product or homogeneous batch of products. Then number 2 is audit of production of a quality assurance system, followed by the final inspection and testing and the full quality assurance system. So these are pretty much key important requirements that will need to be followed. And if you see the manufacturers of a class 2B devices, they require an audit for their complete full quality assurance system, and or a type examination and 1 assessment from choices 1 or 3 that can also be considered, and a type of examination that looks at the technical aspect of a product and verifies that the product meets the essential requirements of the relevant directives and regulations. If the product meets the requirements, the notified body, especially they issue a type of examination certificate to the importer or to the manufacturer. I think we can go on to the following. Yes. So here would be the last classification which I'll be talking about, that is the class 3 devices. In addition to the requirements of a class 2A device, the manufacturers of class 3 devices will also have their design dossier or technical documentation reviewed if they choose to have a full quality assurance audit. And followed by the next step 6, that is to create a quality management system. So this is in general, there is an obligation for the manufacturers to have the complete quality management system that shall cover all parts and elements of the manufacturer's organization that is dealing with the quality of processes, procedures, and devices. And if you see here, there are various different requirements that have been listed. That is, 1 is a strategy for regulatory compliance, including compliance with the conformity assessment, procedures, and procedures for the management of modifications. If there are any changes in the devices, that's where you may have to manage these modifications, that all should be covered by the system. And followed by the identification of applicable general safety and performance requirements. This is very important. So you may also create an analysis table for the GSPR requirements. And you can also map the evidence you have for the GSPR. Example, like what deliverables need updating, or you can also have what new deliverables are required to address these gaps. You can also create a plan to address the gaps identified, followed by the justification for the GSPR if there is something is not applicable in it. Followed by, you can also have a, I would strongly recommend to have a GSPR checklist available where you can clearly present the GSPR compliance. Followed by the responsibility of the management. This is very important, where the management plays a key important role in the implementation of the quality management system. And then the resource management also will be partly like taken care by the management as well. That includes the selection and control of suppliers and subcontractors. So resourcing of the suppliers, especially the contractors and the suppliers, I think selection and monitoring is important, where you can also, as a manufacturer, you can ensure that the quality management system is maintained at the supplier or with this subcontractor by providing a quality agreement with them, and also listing out all the requirements into the quality agreement. That is important, especially for the EU MDR requirements, unannounced audits. This is very important, and I have seen that several times this is not listed in the quality agreement. That's where some of the manufacturers end up in observations. And in the risk management, I think Andrew also will be talking about in the next upcoming slides. But here, what I would focus on the risk management is that you can have a risk management plan, analysis for the risk, as well as the evaluation for all the processes, and followed by the clinical evaluation in accordance with the MDR requirements. When it comes to the product realization, ensure that you have the right documentation for the planning, design, development, production, as well as specifically the manufacturing plan and then the design transfer. So this is where the people, I have seen that the manufacturers between the design as well as the production team, that's where if there is a communication gap, the changes if there are made in the design, those if they are not communicated, that they end up in having a non-conforming product. So make sure that this communication is right at the beginning, and also during if you make any changes in the design. Verification of the UDI assignments made in accordance with the MDR requirements, that is all relevant devices, and ensuring consistency, validity of information provided in accordance with the MDR. Setting up an implementation and maintenance of a post-market surveillance system is important. You can also have the post-market surveillance plan followed by all the specific details that you will be collecting in it. Finally, you will also be handling the communication with competent authorities, notified bodies, or other economic operators, customers, and other stakeholders. And when you have the processes for reporting of serious incidents, this is important, because if you know that, especially in the EU MDR, the time limit based on the risk of the, based on the criticality of the incident that has been identified, that has to be reported within not 30 days, but it's 15 days now. So make sure that these kind of issues you are identifying and making sure that on timely basis you are notifying to the right people. Management of corrective preventive actions, and followed by the measurement of analysis or monitoring and measurement, I would say, that pretty much focuses on the product improvement. And now I will pass on to Andrew to take you through the technical file.
Okay, great, thanks for that. Okay, so step 7 of the CE and CE marking processes is the creation of a technical file, and this is needed for all classes of device. So a technical file, or officially called the technical documentation, is a compilation of the documents that contain all the relevant information about a particular device, including the safety and performance information. So a technical file is used to demonstrate that the product complies with the requirements of the applicable regulations or directives. And this proof of compliance is compulsory for manufacturers to show that their products are safe before being placed on the market in the UK or in Europe. So the technical file includes, there's a list here of some of the parts. Technical file includes some basic information for understanding what the device is, how it's designed, how it's manufactured. It also provides the information that is supplied by the manufacturer with the device. So that's the labeling on the device, instructions for use or IFU, and user manual if it's a active device, generally speaking. And for CE marking, excuse me, The technical file also needs to contain all this information in all the languages required by the countries into which it's sold. But the technical file also contains more in-depth information, such as risk management file, like we just heard about. This is usually put together, produced in accordance with the standard ISO 14971, which describes the process where all the risks to the user or the patient are recorded and controlled. But bear in mind that just by following this standard in this instance is not enough to be in compliance with the UK or the EU MDR, and the risk acceptability criteria in these regulations should also be taken into account. The technical file also includes all the other tests and assessment plans and reports, for example, biological safety or biocompatibility according to ISO 10993, or electrical safety according to IEC 60601, and so on. It also includes the clinical evaluation plan and report. This is specific to medical devices, but for IVDs, a performance evaluation is needed instead. So if we go on to the next slide, then we get into that a bit more detail. So the clinical evaluation is such an important part of the technical file. Sometimes it's over half the page count of the whole technical file. It deserves a bit more of a discussion. The clinical evaluation is a big part of demonstrating the performance and safety of the device and demonstrating that the risks are outweighed by the benefits of the device. But since both performance and safety are relative, the clinical evaluation needs to include a thorough review of the state of the art in treating or diagnosing the relevant condition, and that's to determine that the benchmark against which the device is measured in future. So as the name suggests, the clinical evaluation should be based on a review of clinical data. So that's data from the use of the device on patients. So that's human patients with the right medical condition that's being treated or being diagnosed. So these data can come from a number of places. And the first place to look is to see whether there are any data on the use of equivalent devices, or obviously as well as the device itself. But equivalence is quite a difficult thing to demonstrate, and it should include a review of these three different types of characteristics. So clinical characteristics, is it used for the same intended use? Technical characteristics, does it have the same design, same specifications? And biological characteristics, is it the same materials and in contact with the same patient tissues and so on. And so sometimes certain differences can be allowed as long as they don't have a clinically relevant or clinically significant impact on the equivalent device. However, sometimes there are no equivalent devices or there's insufficient data available on the equivalent devices and the device itself. And this is the case for things like novel devices, in which case a specific clinical investigation might be needed. And that needs to be conducted before the clinical evaluation is completed. However, sometimes small gaps in clinical data can be filled with data obtained in the post-market phase, so data obtained when the device is actually being used in the real world. And this can be sort of used for addressing some smaller gaps in clinical data. Lastly, in terms of the clinical evaluation, for some devices, there can be a justification for not needing clinical data, and this is based on the risks, the claims, and the patient interaction of the device. It's definitely not a common route, and it's more relevant for devices such as a denture cleaning brush, where there's minimal direct patient contact and a low risk. It's much less relevant for devices such as implants, for example. And it also doesn't mean that the full search for clinical data is not required. So moving on to step 8 and the final step, and at this point, if the manufacturer is based outside of the UK or the EU, they'll need to appoint a UK responsible person or a European authorised representative, respectively, if they want to sell in those two territories. And so as the last step, after obtaining any regulatory approvals, the manufacturer would sign the declaration of conformity and affix the CE mark or the UKCA mark, and then move on to the registration of the device. When placing the CE mark on the device, it's important that if a notified body or an approved body was involved in the conformity assessment, that the number is placed either beneath the UKCA mark or somewhere adjacent to the CE mark. And finally, the declaration of conformity and technical file should be kept and made available to authorities if they request it. And as a final step, registration potentially with the MHRA for UKCA and either European Competent Authority, or as it's being rolled out, the UDAMED database has to be made, and sometimes it has to be done through the UK RP or the European Authorised Representative. So now on to the next slide, we move on to the section discussing tips and recommendations for the certification process. So, yeah, so firstly, some general tips. Firstly, defining the correct device classification is critical, since this dictates firstly the approval routes that are available, and even when a notified body or approved body is needed. And these third-party reviews are often very expensive and add significant time delays. So classification is also used to determine the depth of the assessments that are conducted during the development procedure, and sometimes the extent of the testing required. So choosing a classification that's below the one it should be could often lead to delays in marketing because there's unplanned work that arises, or choosing a classification that's too high could lead to unnecessary work being conducted. So the best first steps in determining the classification of the device is looking at the relevant guidance. So for the UKCA, that's the old EU MedDev Medical Device Directive guidance, and for CE marking, it's the newer MDCT guidance, both of which are very useful, and they have some very nice examples as well of different devices for different classifications. So secondly, choice of certification body is also important. As I mentioned before, there's two organisations, BSI and SGS, that can provide both CE and UKCA services. So it can be advantageous if you need both of those. But yeah, there's some notified bodies or approved bodies that don't have a full scope of different devices. So manufacturers of those types of devices wouldn't be able to use that particular notified body. And as always, certification body availability and cost are important factors to consider. So only bodies on the approved list should be used. So that's the list of notified bodies published by the European Commission, or the list of approved bodies published by the UK MHRA. So with regards to the technical file preparation and review in particular, firstly, it's important to ensure that all the relevant information is included. Otherwise, this is a surefire way to get the application will get delayed when it gets to a notified body. So the EU MDR and IVDR contain a detailed list of the required content for a technical file. And that's within annexes 2 and 3 of the MDR and the IVDR. And this is a great resource to use. And in fact, it's a requirement for CE marking. It's also a nice logical way to construct a technical file. So actually at Insight Regulatory, we use this as a structure even when we're doing UKCA submissions applications, because it's just a good process to follow, even though it's not a requirement. So secondly, consistency in the technical file is also paramount. And it's easy for a technical file, as it's easy for a technical file reviewer to pick up on any inconsistencies in the file. And specifically in the case of intended purpose, this is especially important that this is consistent. And in fact, it should be word for word the same throughout the file, because it's such a critical part of the technical file, and impacts everything from device classification to the clinical data requirements. So there's a requirement also within the EU MDR that the file should be presented in a clear and organised and readily searchable manner. So yes, that's why information being clearly presented is so important. Plus, there's nothing more frustrating than wasting a review cycle and pointing out to the reviewer where the information can be found in the file. So the next 2 points are broadly broadly covering the same thing, and it's easy for these, with regard to these, it's easy to forget that the reviewer won't be familiar with the development device of that particular device, and they might not even be overly familiar with the device type in question. So it's important to fully explain all the decisions and justifications that are relevant to the development of the device, for example, such as which products are covered by which tests, and even why tests were conducted the way they were. So lastly, since the clinical evaluation is such an important part of the overall technical file, it's worth mentioning it again here. And in the same vein as the previous tips, consistency and completeness are key. especially with making sure that all aspects of the intended purpose and patient population are sufficiently addressed by the clinical data. And for example, there's ensuring that there are data on the use of the device on, for example, pediatric populations, if pediatric populations is a group that's not contraindicated. And that's it for the general tips. So I'll pass over now to Samantha, who will discuss quality management system audit tips in particular.
Thank you, Andrew. So how to make sure your auditor leaves happy. So it is important to perform the gap analysis to cover all the elements that provide the justification for non-applicability. That means like you can list, I would suggest listing it at least in the quality manual, the items which are not applicable, and use international standards and guidelines for your implementation, especially when you are setting up the acceptable quality limits for the inspections or the quality attributes for the device. And use the right terminology. So I would recommend referring to the regulations and standards for the terminology that is defined, and verify consistency across your file. So that means if there are any changes that have been made for the device, or specifically any other documentation reports, if you have performed the biocompatibility testing, so all these specific details that need to be there in the file, and have all the complete technical file, and then the documentation need to be readily available. So you can also have a clear intended purpose that is red line across the technical documentation to ensure everything is aligning with the requirements. And also provide the necessary information to the auditor. So this is important. So when, especially like sometimes the auditors send you the list of documents they would like to review prior to the audit. If that is the case, you can list them and then make sure that those are available. Consider your device type, identify the risk classification. So classifying the risk is also important. So that's why you may have to identify this risk and have a proper mitigation in place for it. Especially for the software, I see that some of the manufacturers have a question that when can we release the software as a product? So yes, if there are any bugs or anything specific to that, so you can identify those bugs and then make sure that when you are releasing the product, it is conforming product into the market. But however, you can always have a newer version of the software. That is important. So you can always upgrade it as and when it is required. And now I will pass on to Lula for the references and Q&A session. Thank you.
And we can skip to the next slide. That concludes our webinar, and I'll open it up to our question and answer session. We have a few minutes, so we'd love to go through your questions. I can see lots of you have already inputted them, and we'll work through as many as we can here. Anything that we can't, we'll have a record of it, and we'll make sure to get back to you after the webinar. Okay, so I'll start scrolling through some of these. The first question that we got through, it is my understanding that all class 1 through class 3 devices need a CE mark under the MDR. Can self-declaration still exist under the MDR, and how? Samantha and Andrew, would either of you be interested in answering?
I'll jump in with that. I suppose it's similar to some of my slides. So I discussed self-declaration. So all medical devices, well, there's a few exceptions like custom-made devices, need to have a CE mark on them. So how that CE mark is able to be applied to the device is based on the risk class of the device. So generally speaking, class 1 devices, except for sterile measuring or under the EU MDR, reusable surgical instruments, they can be, everything except for those in higher class devices can be self-declared before CE marking, but the other types of devices require a notified body or approved body. But it all ends up in CE marking a device. It's whether or not the notified body or approved body is needed. So in answer to the question, it's a yes, everything needs to be CE marked except for things like custom-made devices.
Perfect, thank you, Andrew. So I see a question here about would a CE mark be necessary for a software product in the healthcare sector that's not classified as a medical device? So I can jump in on that and just say that if the software is intended for general purposes or for lifestyle and wellness purposes, and it's not considered to be a medical device, you just have to be very clear that it is not falling under that medical device category, then you don't need a CE mark to be affixed to it. we'll move to another question now. If we have a CE mark, do we need to go through all the steps again? I'll hand that again with Samantha or Andrew. Would you be interested in answering?
Sure, Lola, I can take it up.
Thank you.
If the various different steps need to be followed to have a proper CE mark, especially all the requirements need to be complied to have that mark. And maybe Andrew, would you like to add a few points here?
Yeah, so assuming this is for UK, UKCA marking as well. So yeah, broadly speaking, there's a lot of similarities with the two. So yeah, you likely have done a lot of the work. Technical file is probably largely the same. Again, to some of my points before about notified bodies and approved bodies, if you have a CE mark that needed a notified body to obtain, but that notified body doesn't also offer UK approved body services, you may need to take that to a UK approved body. Sometimes they can review the certification that you've had from the CE marking notified body and do a quick review, but sometimes it may be more of a sort of review from scratch. So it's probably the large difference is going to be due to any notified body or approved body reviews. Yeah, a lot of overlap as well.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Andrew. We have another question. After the 1st of July, is it then considered fine to add both the UKCA mark and CE mark on the same label, or does it have to have its own product label? So you can add both marks on the same label. Just make sure that if an approved body or notified body was involved, that you include that number as well, but you won't need to have a completely separate UKCA mark label. Okay, Samantha or Andrew, have you seen any questions that you'd like to jump on now? We've had a question here. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, Lola. So here I see a question regarding a patient cable used in an ECG. So the cable connects to the electrode class 1 device and the ECG class 2A device. What class is the cable? Does it need to be certified? It again, I would like to highlight a few points here. Since you already have identified it as a class 1 device and you will be following all the specific requirements as a class 1 device, but however, the risk associated with this cable, that is pretty much important, and that's where you will be able to identify those risks in place to make sure that it is conforming with all the requirements. Here I'll share an example that I have come across where the warranty period that you will be setting up based on the risk assessment and then the material that is used for the cable. I have come across one of the example where there was a product recall again and again because the cable was breaking while in use for a device. If that is the case, the manufacturer has to ensure while setting up the warranty period for these cables to make sure that there isn't any recall, but however, you can come up with alternate options to make sure that the end user is not getting affected by using the medical device.
Perfect. Thank you, Samantha. We have a good question here. What are your thoughts around the bottleneck of the UK approved bodies for assessment? This could pose a massive risk for next year. So this is definitely something we've mentioned throughout the webinar, that because there are only 3 that will cause a delay. Now, recently there was a consultation published, the government response to the MHRA consultation published recently, where they did acknowledge that transition period needed to be more gradual. So there will be extended periods of times. Off the top of my head, I don't know them straight away, but just to let you know, it's very much an issue that the UK government, the MHRA, have highlighted and that they're aware of. So there's a lot of people in the same boat as that. Andrew or Samantha, would you like to add anything additional to that?
Yeah, I'd agree as well. Yeah, it's that the deadline of 1st of July next year is likely to be pushed back, and maybe again for I suppose similar delays potentially for products that require notified body, an approved body for UKCA marking. They're going to be the ones that are going to be affected by that bottleneck, and it might be a case that that products that don't need a notified body don't So don't have an extension because that bottleneck's not relevant. But yeah, we'll see as it comes on. But I think it's probably more likely that there will be a delay than there isn't.
Perfect, thank you. So interesting question here. How does this work if there is servicing in the US? So a device previously sold before the date of July 2023 needs to return to the US for servicing and the label must be replaced. Does the device and the label now need to reflect the UKCA label when it needs to return to the UK customer? So I'll open that up to my colleagues if there's anyone who wants to start on that.
I'll jump in with that. So yeah, as long as it is servicing and it's not a sort of manufacturing of the device, then it comes down to the requirements. So UKCA marking is required for devices that technical term is placed on the market or put into service after the 1st of July next year. So if something's just being serviced, then it's already been placed on the market. So that requirement there doesn't affect it. Essentially, it's if it's just been CE marked before and it's already been placed on the market like that legally, then it can sort of be resupplied after the servicing has been conducted. Yeah, as long as it is servicing and not sort of remanufacturing the device or making significant changes to it.
Great, thank you, Andrew. I see a question here about, is there a huge difference between the EU MDR and the UK MDR? So I'm happy to give a bit of information on that, and I know Samantha can probably add to that as well. But in short, yes, there is. The UK MDR is based on the directives that the EU MDR replaced. And the reason those regulations were brought in was because Europe decided they needed much stricter regulations in order to ensure that devices and products being placed on the market were safe. It was part of this was in response to PIP polyimplant prothese. I don't know if you heard of that case study where breast implants were sold with industrial grade silicone as opposed to medical grade. And that was kind of one of the things that awoken the European side of the competent authorities up to ensure that those regulations were going to meet those stricter requirements. So Samantha, I don't know, do you want to add, without going too into detail, what the difference is between the two?
Yes, sure, Lola here. So what I would say that as you mentioned, the various different requirements that would be applicable. But apart from this, I believe especially the EU MDR requirements would be more you may have to focus on. But when it comes to the UK MDR requirements, that is pretty much overlaps with EU MDR. But however, you need to identify based on the risk, again, the risk classification and the classification of the device. Anything to add on to this, Andrew?
I think you covered it. I mean, it's essentially the like I said as well, the UK regulations based on the old EU directives, and then there's obviously been some changes to the EU legislation moving from the directives to the regulations. So there's a lot of good sort of blogs and guidance out there about what the changes to the EU MDR and IVDR were before. So it's sort of big things, sort of UDI and different classifications, and especially things like classification of software has been heavily affected and things like that. So yeah, there's definitely been a few significant changes being made.
Great.
Yes, absolutely.
I see another question here. Is there a checklist for UKCA marking to ensure everything is covered? I personally haven't come across one myself. Samantha or Andrew, would you have any good resources for that?
I would recommend going to the UK guidance documents and then can identify. But as you mentioned, Lula, I haven't come across any checklist, but can be developed in-house if they can.
Yeah, again, I second that. I mean, there's I mentioned it somewhat sort of briefly, but in terms of technical file content, the MDR and the EU MDR and IVDR contain section Annex 2 and Annex 3 that talk about technical file contents. They also have Article 10, which talks about quality management system requirements and things like that. So again, while these aren't directly applicable to UKCA, or they just sort of provide additional information. It's useful as a guide as well for that. But yeah, it's navigating the EU MDR. It's quite a weighty document, so it's not always easy just to pick up and find what you need.
Great. Does the UKCA QMS, is it required to comply with ISO 13485? Would anyone like to jump in? It's not mandatory. I can start that. It's not mandatory to comply with 13485 for the UKCA mark, but it is, if you're selling a medical device and implementing a QMS, that is a standard that I would follow.
I think you put it well before in terms of compliance with the requirements of the regulations. Using the relevant standards is definitely the best choice. So if you want to put a QMS together for a medical device, then what better place could you look to than 13485? Like I said, Lola, trying to justify using an alternative structure is a bit of an uphill struggle, I think. So yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you there. And if anyone who's listening to the webinar hasn't already seen, the list of harmonized or designated standards, they're easy to find on the relevant websites, and just take a look through those, because it will save you a lot of time. Trying to justify why you don't comply to a standard is going to be a lot more work than just following what's already recommended.
Absolutely, I totally agree with you and Lola and Andrew. I think especially like if you are adapting the 13485, pretty much it streamlines all the quality management system at your end as a manufacturer, or at in all the processes. So it is suggested to have, but it's not mandatory, as Lola and Andrew mentioned.
Samantha, a more Qualio related one for us. Do you provide a template for technical files, and are there specific headings that should be included?
From Qualio, we provide, we guide, how a technical file can be created. And if it is from Qualio Plus program, definitely we will be supporting the team to understand and also provide a technical file template.
Yes, that is definitely one of the advantages of being with Qualio. Okay, so we might answer one more before we end the webinar. And as I mentioned, anything that hasn't been answered, we'll make sure to get back to you afterwards. If our suppliers apply a CE mark, what would be our responsibility? And I'll leave that open for anyone to jump in.
I suppose it depends what they do, I'd say. I mean, if it's a supplier, if they're acting as an importer or a distributor, then there's specific requirements in the EU MDR for that. So basically, it's a case of, I mean, Samantha covered that before, but sort of checking the upstream conformity of the product. So if you're the importer, checking that the device from the manufacturer has the right labeling and the CE mark and declaration of conformity. Similarly, if you're the distributor as well. But if this company's response type of organization is different from either of those, then yeah, the responsibilities would differ as well. I mean, other times, if the product is supplied, but the company puts their own name and address on it as a manufacturer, then obviously they'd be counted as a manufacturer, and CE marking would have to be reapplied as them as a manufacturer. So it really depends on what the company actually does.
Yes, Andrew, I totally agree with that. And as well as you may have to define or determine the product that is going to be launched into the market. So if the supplier is following, then it depends on where exactly you are going to launch the product into the market in EU especially. So based on that, you may have to follow the CE mark.
Perfect. Thanks very much for answering that. Great, well, we've just come to the end of our webinar, so we will end our session here. Thank you so much to everybody who joined us today. The webinar will be available afterwards, and as I've mentioned, any questions that are unanswered will also be answered. Thank you, everyone. Bye.